Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Meyer, and I wanted to thank you for watching in with this as we become more familiar with the latest changes to FERPA. Are we looking at with FERPA? Now, most of us probably recall seeing some of this in our training coming up into education. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. To summarize it in a couple bullet points, it's a federal law created to protect the confidentiality of student records and information. I think we all have kind of a gist of what this is, but we need to really look more in depth at what we need to do to uphold and to keep it. Some other pieces. This provides rights to parents on behalf of their children. Rights are transferred to students at the age of 18, or if they're attending a post secondary education. Administration is administered by the Family Policy Compliance Office of the Department of Education, and FERPA applies to all schools that receive federal funding for any programs administered by the Department of Education. So, us at Bennington High School do have to abide by FERPA because we receive federal funding from the Department of Education. So, when we're talking about the rights that are going to be protected, we need to kind of ask what rights are protected. First and foremost is the protection of information. This protects personally identifiable information, or PII, in education records from disclosure without consent form by parents or those eligible students. That information cannot be given out anywhere else. It also gives the rights for educational records, that parents have the right to see and access log for those educational records, to access their educational records for their child, and also these logs show who has access to records, for as well as further disclosures made by state and federal authorities. There's also the rights to deny and to opt out. So parents have the right to deny access to others outside the school system, to opt out of military recruitment contacts, and the disclosure of a student's directory information. And then corrections and complaints. Parents also have the right to the process to correct errors, sometimes including a hearing and a formal complaint process that will be handled by the Family Compliance Office of the USDE. So, really, when we're talking about what is protected, we mentioned the educational record, and the educational record is anything directly related to a student that is maintained or held by the educational institutions. This can be a series of things such as name, address of the student and parents, social security numbers, student number, personal characteristics, date, place of birth, biometric data now, test scores, economic circumstance, ethnic background, and any other identifiable information. The list is, nearly exhaustive. So, what also might be surprising is that medical records can become protected in FERPA. Generally, medical records are maintained and protected by HIPAA regulations through medical office, but when medical information is shared and entered into school files, that information becomes educational record. An example of this would be health providers providing immunization records to schools based on parents' agreements. And once that goes into the educational record, it's protected by FERPA as well. And then lastly, there's questions and concerns about images and videos. An image or video qualifies as educational record material when it is directly related to a student. So, there's a lot of play on this, but in particular, this would include recordings such as security cameras that capture video for disciplinary action, student violating a law, getting injured, emergency situations that directly are related to the student. This also would include student ID photos and other identifiable information. So, are there exceptions? Can things be shared? Of course, there are almost always exceptions to some of these things. Three that are most identifiable that you would see would be law enforcement, school officials, and in emergency situations. These are not likely to happen in the classroom. except for in extraordinary circumstances. So let's look at these. With law enforcement, it's typically in emergencies, threats to school safety, or other extraordinary circumstances. The officers can be given access to information. Immigration officers will not be given immigrant status as schools are considered sensitive locations, and those immigration officers are required to refrain from enforcement action in schools. That is a worry, but there is that. Law enforcement will be given information when they have a court-ordered subpoena, and school resource officers have some exemptions if they are employed and working in the school. And again, it is directly related to the student and is of legitimate educational interest, a term that we'll mention again here with school officials. Special circumstances for disclosure of educational records may occur when other school officials have legitimate educational interest. This could be a variety of things, but it is key on that statement again, legitimate educational interest. So this may be another teacher or a co-teacher that the student has. It may be a principal, could be a president of something. It could be a registrar for, admissions and counselors, attorneys, depending on what programs and affiliations the student may end up having. And then, of course, emergencies. Appropriate officials in health and safety emergencies may need that information of students. Always remember that student safety is priority, whether that's for their information or whether that's for them physically. So an example would be allergies. If teachers have the known allergy list of a student when paramedics show up because they had to get an EpiPen because they were in anaphylactic shock, that's important information to share because at that moment, their safety and health is more important than if somebody knew what they were allergic to. So teachers, staff, we have some responsibilities. And I broke this up into two lists, a be careful and a do not. So when I go through this list, just remember, be careful of these instances. Always keep student data secure by using our data management systems that we already have. Only discuss student information with parents and necessary staff. This is not something to talk about anywhere, anytime, only with necessary people. Don't use websites that require students to put in personal info. If it is asking for students to input information about them, we need to find another resource. Find out what companies or vendors or schools establish proper working relationships with already. We can talk to counselors and our administration for some of these if we can align some of them. And always continue to review and evaluate the technology you and students use. Sometimes you're going to have to replace something because it wants student information, and we cannot allow that to go out. And in the do not list, remember each of these is a do not. Do not email information to unverified parent email addresses. Check with the office for updates on contact sheets. Do not leave out any physical gradebooks, information sheets, IEPs, etc. If you have something such as an IEP printed out, that needs to be locked, secure, or after you review that information, you have what's necessary. We need to destroy that properly. Do not discuss student information with others unless that person has a legitimate educational goal for the students. Do not answer a request to send information or records without checking with administrators. We need to verify those who is requesting, and honestly, that all should go through the office anyways. And then lastly, do not review records or materials that you should not have access to. If you do not have the student, if it is not pertinent to you, there's no interactions, do not review that material if asked. As for FERPA compliance, here's a list of a couple things just to keep in mind to help us keep in compliance. We are a public institution, so we must comply to FERPA. Complete your vector training assignments, including the FERPA training, before classes start in August. This is a required training on our vector trainings that you have to have done by the deadline. Number 3, review the BOE policy manual on FERPA guidelines. I have just a brief over it at the end of the slideshow here. And number 4, encrypt files and emails with sensitive info. Also, simply just do not share anything that is not necessary to be shared over an email. It's not totally secure, so we should not be giving those things out. Number 5, choose compliant educational vendors for resources, materials, and all classroom activities. We don't need to share anything about students outside. And number 6, ask an administrator if you are ever unsure. Student safety will always be number one priority. Looking at the USD 240 policy manual on student privacy, I would say that within our USD 240 policy manual, we have a sufficient explanations on how and what data is used for and if it will or will not be shared. We also provide opt-out opportunities and require parent signature for use and disclosure of all data, information, and images that are collected and identifiable to students within our district. To read more on our BOE policy manual, you need to see the following sections. It's going to be under IDAE, and it's labeled Student Privacy Policy, and it has these sections within it. Regulation, Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. That covers surveys, written permission required, physical examinations, parental rights on marketing information, and the release of information on FERPA rights, and as well as having our annual notice of authorized student data disclosures, which is a requirement for FERPA. These are some resources that I used to put together the information today. And I want to say thank you for taking a little bit of time to update yourself on FERPA for our student privacy.